because in 2 minutes we will switch over automatically on our virtual platform. So
sure,
you are the chief data.
I'm the principal data scientist at SailPoint. We have a data science team that's in charge of advancing AI and machine learning for access management and access governance solutions to provide AI solutions to the problems from this field. Okay. I have been a mathematician almost all my life, and then discovered data science and AI in 2012, 2013. Then started working as a data scientist in Accenture.
Okay.
That was my previous employer. It's a consulting firm. I worked for the Data Science Center of Excellence for 3.5 years or so, doing a lot of consultant projects with companies on the West Coast and the Bay Area, and internal projects as well at Accenture. And then left for SailPoint, and I've been there for almost like 3.5 years again.
Okay.
I think there is a huge potential for AI and ML to grow for a lot of industries, yes. Especially in access governance and access management applications. As we're going to see, hopefully my presentation will do that some kind of justice. So
yes, and just for everyone, I got a chance of looking through your presentation a couple of days ago, and I was like, oh, I cannot wait for this. So cool. So cool. Yeah, the stage is all yours. You're ready to share your screen.
Let me share my screen and see how I can go here. Oops. So
there you go.
Let me see if I can go into presentation mode. So how does that look?
Perfect. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So hi. Sorry. Thank you everyone for coming today. Our talk is the quest for balance in access management, how AI can optimize productivity and security in the modern enterprise. Access management or access governance, for the purposes of this particular talk, I'm not going to really draw any lines between the two. These are industry-specific terminologies, and they probably has to do with the solutions rather than the problems. So I think the challenges and problems facing both are equally, they're the same kind of problems. Access governance, though, is more like towards like having more sophisticated tools, and that's where maybe AI and ML fits. But access management is probably more accessible to a lot more people. So, let me see. Okay, so where do we start? Well, when people think of cybersecurity and access issues and access governance or access management issues, the first thing that comes to mind is risk. So that could be a very good point for us to start our talk today. But risk is hard to define, and there are reasons for that. Risk depends heavily on the industry. So the typical risks you see from a bank is different and widely different actually from what you see from a hospital. So lack of common themes, again, if a company or if we are trying to tackle this issue across the board, we need some common themes so that we can abstract these common themes and draw some conclusions and basically draft approaches towards solutions. Also, as you can see from on the right side, like there is a lot of local and global regulations, from the EU's GDPR to within the healthcare. You have the HIPAA, protecting personal information and medical records. You have the cybersecurity attacks, ransomware, and you have the compliance issue. Compliance could be, again, due to local or global regulations, or it could be due to internal policies or audits that are regular in many of the industries that our clients or customers come from. Risk and access governance is a particular, of course, subset of that. And the challenges here is how to define it and how to tackle it and how to manage such a problem. And by managing here, we mean identifying the risks and predicting and where the risks are possibly coming from, being proactive instead of reactive, and proposing solutions to prevent or mitigate the risks or the liabilities that come from these risks. So risk and access governance as a specific problem we can see that there are certain potential sources of risk in access governance. Policy violations is one, rampant approvals and certification campaigns. So if people are not familiar, a certification campaign is when a company basically starts a campaign where all the managers or the access owners will have to certify, basically approve or deny the access currently attained by its employees. And that's from the face of it, from the definition of it, it requires a lot of man hours on the side of these managers to basically go and study what kind of access do their employees currently hold and whether to approve or deny that and so forth. Entitlement inflation and role proliferation are two other problems. And entitlement inflation is self-explanatory. It's just people, and we're going to have actually a particular example, a very strong example of that towards the end of the presentation. That's when people start to accumulate access permissions, and that's what entitlements here represent. The longer they stay in the company, and if that goes unmonitored again, that's would become a high source of risk. Role proliferation goes to the granularity of roles. So on average, you could see for some companies that on average a person would hold like 50 roles, and each role has a bunch of like 5 to 50 different type of entitlements per role. So you will see things starting to grow out of control. So this is basically about scale and size of something that you want to manage. Mismanaging privileged or restricted access is another form, but then the question is always there is like, what else is there? So these are the known risks, and if there are particular approaches to this problem that would also allow us to discover what is oblivious to us, that would be a plus for sure. And then comes the kind of like philosophical approach here is like, what are we trying to do? Like, it depends again on the industry. So if you go to a bank or a financial company, you will see that there is a lot of stress on security, of course, because they have a lot to lose due to regulations. It's a heavily regulated industry. And one might say, if we exaggerate just to make the point across, what about the absolute security approach? An absolute security approach means that no one gets anything. No one gets any entitlements unless they are heavily monitored and approved in a very certified way, or in a very proper methodology or approach. And that has an impact, right? So if you make it harder for your employees to gain access to the tools that will make them productive, then productivity is going to suffer. And vice versa, if you try to say, oh, I want to allow my employees to get absolute freedom in getting what they want, of course, that naively doesn't work because, again, of laws and regulations and liabilities and so forth. So there has to be, the point here is that we have to have some point, I mean, where our access model has to be, it obviously has to be somewhere in the middle between absolute security and absolute productivity. And maintaining this kind of point, this balance point between the two approaches is really what the crux of the matter, the crux of this is the topic that we're talking about today. And the hope is that AI and machine learning would provide us with a way so that we can optimize this process, so that we can always, not just one time, that we can always maintain an optimal balance point between these two. And then, so once you agree with me on that, then you say, okay, why can't we just do it? I mean, I can just assign as many or hire as many employees on my IT security team, and we could do it day to day, week to week, month to month, and so what? Well, the problem is that manual labor, humans, is really not the answer, and there is a reason for that, as we're going to see in an example I prepared for this presentation. That humans have, of course, biases, and humans, no matter how many you hire, they are not scalable. One of the interesting stories that we heard from one of our customers is that they had like a team of 20 people working on their access model, which is basically try to answer the question, who should get access to what in terms of roles and entitlements. And it took them like an extended period of time, like 4 or 6 weeks, until they finalized the first access model. But then like a new regulation came into the scene, became law, and the company had to abide by this policy. And this actually single policy had to do, or one of its implications is that they had to revise the whole approach. And because this team spent a lot of hours and a lot of tedious work was actually spent to achieve this access model, half of the team just quit because they said, no way, we're going to do that on a regular basis. That's not what we're here for. That's not how we view our career, and et cetera, et cetera. So again, humans and manual labor is not the answer here. Even if it works once, it's hard to maintain. On the other hand, machines don't suffer any of these problems. Scaling machines in the cloud or scaling our computational resources in the cloud is something that's very easy to do. You just have to pay for it. Humans, unlike humans, machines don't have these inherent biases. And machines can actually learn. And again, for the non-specialist, this is something that we're going to touch upon. So where do we start really this risk and access governance? So let's start by going over like some of the easy stuff. Like, again, we said that there are a lot of hurdles till we reach like a global, unified or universal approach that will allow us to model risk and access governance across the board for all the industries. But let's start like, okay, what's an easy way? So an easy place to start from would be anomalies and outliers. So what is an anomaly? So an anomaly is something that's different from the norm. So once you have an agreement, very general agreement or very generic agreement, or what does it mean to be norm within a particular field, like what your access governance data should look like, then it's not far from that where you can say, oh, this data or this behavior looks rather weird from the rest, or rather different from the rest. Particularly anomalies is as a term in computer science and machine learning and AI and access and risk specialists is actually a term that's actually reserved for data that's like temporal data, which is like a function in time, like time series data, or something like that relates to behavior, for example. Like here, the picture, you have a lot of penguins, and for example, to identify, if you're a scientist, try to identify like sick penguins, then probably this has to do with the behavioral, day-to-day behavioral of these animals. So that is something that's not fairly easy to get, and you have to know quite a bit of data and information about these the population that you're dealing with. On another hand, there is a much easier type of anomalies called outliers. And as you can see from the picture, this is actually a picture I took from the 4th floor of our company's headquarters, and I thought it's like you can't miss it, right? If we're going to have to pick one tree out of the sea of trees that you see here, there is a particular one that just sticks like a sore thumb, which is the one in the middle, the one that has an extremely different color than the rest of the green shade, right? So that gets us to the outlier subclass of anomalies, which is, this is a particular class of anomalies, and you can define it easily in terms of extreme values of a certain metric or certain metrics. And they constitute the low-hanging fruit among all the anomalies that we can identify. Okay, so let's go for a quick quiz, a mental exercise. So the question is, can you identify all the outlier axes? And this is a rhetorical question. I'm just like looking at these 5 individuals here. A, B, C, and D represents the kind of entitlements or permissions or access tokens that they have. And then the question is like, if I ask someone, even non-specialist, like, can you pick the identities here who have like the access that doesn't belong or like weird? There could be actually many different answers. I'm not claiming there is a particular answer, but one such answer could be that Joe and Jane's access looks different from the rest. And one possible way to actually formalize that is to say both Joe and Jane have just 2 entitlements, where the rest of the population have exactly 3. Okay, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is to say, Joe's axis is different because he's the only person who has the entitlement E that no one else has. So that's another way to characterize Joe as an outlier here in this population. Another one is to say, hey, Jane, it seems that Jane is missing entitlement A, which seems to be like a mandatory or like a very popular access item for the rest of the population. Okay, so there are several ways to, okay, so, and that's an acceptable answer. But in life, in real life situations, things are not that simple. So if you want to kick it up a notch or two, here is the challenge for you. So what I have here is that each row represents a user or an identity. So we have a total of 50 identities going from user 1 all the way to user 50. And the columns represents the different entitlements that they might have. And we have here 26 of them, symbolized by the letter A through Z. So each one, each identity will have exactly, this is how the example, this particular example is made. We made it exactly a little bit harder than the quiz because each user has exactly 10 entitlements, which means picking up outliers based on the number of access items or entitlements that they have is going to be impossible here. Everyone has exactly 10. Okay, and we're asking you the same question, find the outliers. And that's a much harder problem for a human to identify. And I can tell you one thing or two before we see the solution. So what's the one thing? Well, I constructed this example. This example was particularly made to highlight a particular insight that we observe across all our customers' data set, which is that there are actually patterns of access that exist in this seemingly random hodgepodge of access entitlements assignment. So there is actually, in this particular example, there are 3 highly dominant patterns of entitlements that are available in this data set. And basically the outliers are the ones who do not adhere to either one of these 3 patterns. And if you just have to pause and think, if you think this is daunting for humans to do, think about real life situations. This is by no stretch of the imagination any approximation to what you actually observe in reality. So in reality, in a typical company or a typical modern enterprise, you have thousands of identities. The identities may not be even like one-to-one, may not even be human. So in some companies, half the identities that they have are just bots that they created to facilitate certain functions within the organization. So you have thousands of identities. You have hundreds of entitlements per identity, not just 26. The average number typical we have in our customer pool, for the average customer, the mean or median number of entitlements per identity is around like 300 or 500, sometimes even more. And you have 10,000s or 100,000s and sometimes even millions of entitlements. So this is still a baby example, but it proves to be very challenging for us humans. And what I'm just pulled to the screen is, this is the solution. So the highlighted rows, there is exactly 10 highlighted rows. And these are what I claim to be the outliers in this case. This is the solution. So why is that? Well, if you take a look at this solution to the problem, a human like you and me might observe that, okay, I see that, well, we have 10 outliers, okay. Maybe we would have needed some time to fish them out completely, but we could see that 7 out of the 10 are missing the popular entitlement H. So if you look at the H column, you will see that it's a very popular because it's blacked out, right? So a lot of people have entitlement H, and actually 7 out of these outliers, 7 out of the 10 are missing this one. Likewise, they are missing the 50%, 5 out of the 10 are missing the popular entitlement V. 70% of them have the rare entitlement L. So L, on the other hand, is a rare entitlement, but 7 out of these 10 outliers have this particular entitlement L. And likewise, 50% of them have the rare entitlements A and E. So a human might say, can't we just use these as rules so that we can identify these outliers in the future? I mean, simple, right? So you can say, take enough of these rules to guarantee that you define all of these, you identify all of these 10 outliers. And that's it. That's the solution that you provide to your organization. And that's how you're going to identify access outliers from now on. The problem here is that, and I'm giving you how I constructed, like when I constructed this example, I constructed by taking these like three dominant access patterns, and basically for the rest, for these outliers, I created their access completely randomly. So any patterns that you see is just because us humans see patterns in anything. And that is something has to do with how our brains work. So what's the problem with that? The problem with that is you cannot maintain these kind of insights going from day to day, week to week, month to month. So chasing these random patterns over time, and they could be potentially random in the sense that there is nothing inherent about the working of the inner workings of your organization that mandate that people that have different type of access or risky type of access will have to adhere always to these rules that human could identify. So chasing these potentially random patterns over time is not the way to go. So let's see how a machine could actually solve this question or solve this problem. Well, what we do is, and again, if you have seen the previous talk about the privacy and the homomorphic encryption, you will see that one of the words that was mentioned was having a graph structure representing your data. And the nice thing about a graph is it doesn't care about the inherent values. It cares more about the relationships between the values. So here we establish a relationship of access similarity based on what's called the Jacquard distance or the Jacquard similarity measure. So in this particular case, the Jacquard similarity is defined as the overlap over the union. So you see this Venn diagram having the access items on one side, A through D, the other person has from C through F. So they are sharing 2 entitlements out of 6, so that's 1/3. So this means the Jacquard is approximately 33% between these two. So we actually established this between every pair of identities out of the total 50 that we had on the example or the quiz question, the challenge. And then we construct this identity graph where each node represents one of these 50 identities, and the edges between any 2 identities have these weights, these Jacquard similarity weights that represents how similar their access entitlements are to each other. Then we just prune, and the reason we prune is like there are several reasons to do that, but one of the reasons is that, hey, most of these access similarities are very weak. Like if you're 10 or even 30% similar to someone in terms of access similarity, much like we see in this example, like the 33% one, this is not the kind of like strong similarity that would mandate certain actions. Like if you and I are employees or identities in a huge organization, and we're only like, again, 10 or 30% similar, it means, again, no action should really spread. Like my access should not really spread to your access and vice versa. So if you prune this identity graph to a high degree of, like a threshold, a high degree of similarity here, in this case, it's 70%, you actually identify 3 clusters. And the 3 clusters exactly and precisely represent the 3 dominant patterns of access entitlements. And then you're left with these like 10 orange nodes that have no strong connections or similarities whatsoever. In fact, the strongest similarity ever between them and any other identity was less than 40%. While within the clusters that you see, the similarities was 100% because the access pattern was exactly identical in each one of these clusters. So these clusters, you might think about them as actually roles, different or distinct roles in the organization. So this is a viable way going day to day, week to week, month to month, not only because machines can do it, but because it's scalable and it's generic enough, it doesn't carry any of the biases that humans may certainly or could potentially identify as the underlying reason. One thing to note here, this is not the only way to identify the outliers. There are multiple algorithms that could identify outliers for this and provide a solution for this example. It's just that the graph data structure here, as we're going to notice on the, and come to that and say a little bit more in depth, talk a little bit more in detail about why graph data structures are actually, for access governance problems, they help a lot. That's why we at the company I work for, they provide us with a data structure that could actually lend itself to providing us solutions to multiple problems at the same time. So again, why graphs? They are, in our humble opinion, the natural shape of access data. Because if you look at access data, a typical access data, like a data set that describe access across an organization, it's very much like a grocery item shopping. Like you say, Joe went to the grocery and just bought like milk, sugar, coffee, creamer, and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily about the items themselves. So most of these data sets are categorical in nature. So it's not really about the values. It's more about the relationships. It's more about what your peers have and what your peer groups dictates, et cetera, et cetera. It enables us to, this data structure enable us to see the data. And see here doesn't have to exactly mean that it's visually like a visual representation, but also see it in different other prospects, and you can visualize or like get a lot of like graph analytics inspired metrics that could describe and analyze your access structure for you. It's robust with noisy data, and this is something that has to do with the pruning that we do. Some people say, okay, how do you deal with noise? Because you would have definitely like noisy, if someone has, again, on average, like 300 entitlements, some of these entitlements might be there by mistake. But here's the thing, when you prune the edges to like 70 or 80% of similarity, it's highly unlikely that people will be 80% similar because they have entitlements that are earned by mistake. So, and again, this is due to the fact that we have a high number of entitlements on average, 300 or 500. It's highly unlikely 70 or 80% of those are just there by error. And if it is in such case, then definitely you have a much more serious problem in your organization than just an access governance thing we're trying to address. Highly interpretable results as a result, and it adds context, as just say, when you have a peer group, it's much easier to give justification to the kind of access that you should obtain or you should revoke, et cetera, et cetera. And it also enriches the existing data with graph features that can be used for AI and machine learning model training. So certain graph features, certain graph centrality measures, you could actually utilize like number of hops and centrality measures like the degree or the in-betweenness could actually be utilized as independent features for further AI and machine learning models. And we're going to talk about that particular examples and use cases on the following slides. Finally, as I mentioned, there is a huge library of graph analytics algorithms that could help us tackle and solve various governance problems. So what else is there? And this is something that I believe is very unique to graph data structure, because this is a particular type of outlier that comes of an entitlement inflation problem that is very hard to identify if you represent your data in the standard, regular, or traditional tabular approach. So let's see this, go over this example. So here we have Ted. He's from receivables in some company, we call it Ajax. He's been working there for 5+ years. And during this time, he collaborated with a lot of teams. And as a result, he accumulated way more access than he needs. So there wasn't that much regularity in the certification procedures there. And he basically got away with a lot of access items. I am going to show you a particular example with this person. Is going to be strongly similar to two different teams, and these teams are not similar to each other at all. And actually that could be arranged by just adding 33% more entitlements than any exist on either teams. So how is that possible? This is kind of counterintuitive, but unfortunately this is realistic, and we can actually see and compute the Jacquard similarity. So here you see particular examples between, so I assigned access for teams A and B, and if you compute the Jacquard similarity between teams A and B, you'll see that the similarity is 48.5%. We count the overlapping entitlements, the blue ones, divided by all the available entitlements shared between teams A and B, the union, and it's 49 out of 101, and that's approximately 48.5%. Likewise, if you measure the similarity between TED and team A or TED and team B, you'll actually get a whopping 74%. And you see here that this person managed to achieve this by just acquiring 25 more entitlements, which is 1/3 more of what each team originally had. So these what we call structure outliers, and the reason they are called that because they have a particular vantage point on the graph, that they are not just similar to too many identities, it's just that they are similar to too many peer groups in a way. So they have access, so this could surface certain types of potentials that, for example, give violations to certain SODs, like separation of duties policies that says, oh, a person cannot like write the check and cash the check at the same time, right? No conflict of interest stuff. So these structure outliers provide basically a precursor to SOD violations. So that's where these kind of risks could emanate from. And definitely identifying these outliers could be something that provide you with a way to enact certain policies that would prevent or mitigate these kind of liabilities or risk coming out of this kind of examples. So machines could learn. I mean, if you are outside of the realm of AI and machine learning, and again, if you follow the hype that we see about AI day-to-day, almost on a daily basis, you see something that that an industry that AI disrupted one way or another. And lots of people actually do not know or do not realize that we have machine learning algorithms that are not really far off from the mechanisms and the ways that humans actually learn themselves. So in general, at least one type of machine learning for the expert in the audience, I'm talking about supervised learning here. In supervised learning, generally speaking, the way it works by associating existing patterns in the data with a particular label. So for instance, here, as you can look at the picture on the right side, you will see that what we have is like two sets of points, red and green, and that's basically the label I'm talking about. But you see there is like, when you represent this data set, and by the way, this data set is not two-dimensional. This is taken from one of the examples that we worked at my company, and the data set here was about 50-dimensional, and it has to do with certification campaign decisions, like either to approve or deny certain access from particular identities. So green means approve, red means revoke. So you see here, like a human would actually, if you can see that if you can draw like a line or a path that separates the green points from the red points, then that's basically how a machine learning model would actually do it. So machine learning models would basically try to learn how to associate these patterns with the label and basically draw this line that discriminate between the two labels. And then once the machine has learned all these kind of patterns, so models can be trained on the existing historical data to minimize the errors in judgment in their predictions and maximize the patterns learned. And once that learning process has ended, then you could use the model during inference in production to try to infer further and future decisions. In essence, again, human and machine learning share quite a lot of common ground. The first neural network model, and that actually came back in 1958, was called the perceptron. were based on a very simplistic model still. It was a model of how our brain neurons would work. Currently, at this day and age, advances in neuroscience, especially the ones where the particular area of study has to do with the frontal cortex of the human brain. So there is a lot of tricks and a lot of constructions that AI practitioners would actually learn from neuroscience. And the relationship between the two disciplines actually goes back and forth. So machine learning models can actually teach us or teach neuroscientists how the human brain actually works. So it's quite exciting and exhilarating to actually see the interactions. But again, the aim of this particular slide is basically to communicate the idea that the idea of learning is just like learning is not just particular to humans. So how about access machine learning applications? How do you use that and apply that for access governance or to solve access governance problems? Well, as I just mentioned, models could be trained to infer the correct decision in a certification campaign. So a manager doesn't have to spend like tens of hours trying to decipher whether a particular access item should be awarded or revoked from one of his or her employees. So the model actually would do all the basic heavy lifting in the back and just render the particular prediction to the manager. Lo and behold, it can reduce a lot of the hours and the expenses spent on certification campaigns. And again, certification campaigns could be part of an audit process or following like a particular either internal or external policy that the company has to adhere to. The other thing that we're also observing is that the fact that if you still, the more you burden these human managers by saying that you have to certify your employees for the access they have, the more they tend to say, oh, I'm going to just approve all. And that's, of course, that's like a really serious, could have some serious consequences. On another another use case could be that we saw this kind of graph structure of the access governance. This actually could be utilized along with other models of certain collaborative filters or content filters to train recommender systems to recommend access to new joiners or mover or maintain a healthy, accurate access model. So even if your first access model was designed by humans or a human team, maintaining that day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month could be actually done completely autonomously, utilizing machine learning models and recommender systems. As we talked about the example earlier, we could actually use models to identify outliers and high-dimensional data. So you don't have just have one metric, or you could have several metrics that you think could be sensitive or could have certain relevance to certain liabilities that you have for your business. And existing algorithms, like, for example, isolation forests, could be used to identify outliers in this data. Clustering and advanced graph techniques allow us to discover new high quality roles, much like these clusters we saw in the example earlier. Consolidate identical and near identical and highly concurrent roles. As you can see from the graphical representation on the right, believe it or not, this is taken from actual real world data set. All the green nodes that you see represent identical roles that in many cases the IT admin was unaware of, that they have these kind of exactly identical roles. And identical here is identical in their how they are comprised of the entitlements they are made up of. The purple ones, the purple colored ones, are the ones that 90% similar or high. And there are certain mitigation actions that you can do. And one outcome of this is just simplifying the role and access model that you have in the organization. And the simpler the access model is, the much easier to manage and much less resources you have to spend on it. Identify common and unique access. And this is something that we can talk about in discussions. Continuously monitor the peer structure of every identity. And that's something, again, that you could easily identify new joiners or movers and so forth. And this all goes to how we can maintain our access model and put it in tip-top shape. That's all of that we talked about up until this point in the presentation was just about the static kind of like assignment of access tokens or entitlements to identities. If you couple that with any activity data that you might have, that could open like a completely perpendicular universe that could even make or add another degree of like accuracy to every single model and use case that we've gone so far. So if I can, for example, monitor the activity data, I can tell you that, oh, these kind of access entitlements are not warranted because they have not been utilized by this identity, and maybe you can mark them for being revoked or mark them for removal. So we said that earlier that machine learning could do this and could actually be transparent. How about, I mean, how is that possible? I mean, the kind of like common knowledge is that most of these advanced machine learning models are kind of like black boxes, and we cannot really know how they think or how they arrive to the certain conclusion. And in effect, to the specialist, there is not a single model that's a black box. That's a common misconception. So it's really, the issue here is not about being a black box or not. It's really about layers or degrees of, or levels of abstraction. It's kind of like when you go to your physician, the physician does not, and the physician say, okay, you have the flu. Based on this, like, okay, so you conduct a test, and based on this test, okay, you have the flu. The inner workings of how this test, for example, has to do with biochemistry. And I mean, that's a field that depends at its core depends on quantum mechanics, which is like our best model for the physics of reality. But when you go to your doctor, you don't get a lesson in quantum mechanics in order for him to explain to you that you have the flu. So basically, that's really it. If you really if you have a very complex model, like a neural network model or a deep learning model with multiple layers, it's really hard for a human to look at the outputs of such model and be able to identify in a very concise time, in a very short time, that basically what the model is doing. So that's where ML interpretation tools come to the scene and allow us to actually peer or X-ray what the model is thinking about. And judging by the picture here, it seems that our model wants to go to the beach or something. So we'll see how that goes. So as a result of motivated by certain regulations, and in this particular case by maybe the EU's GDPR policy that were enacted like several years ago. So open source tools like Lime and Shab allow us to peer into what the model is doing and have kind of a human understanding of the model's decisions. Lime, they use different approaches. Lime uses a localized linear approximation, basically approximating the complex model locally by either linear regression or logistic regression. Shab works utilizing game theory by basically looking at all the features utilized by the model, thinking of the features as players in a game, and try to evaluate the value of each of these players and how they play in the final decision output of the model, outputted by the model. So these tools are the nice thing about it is that they are all model agnostic. So they work from the outside, much like an X-ray machine. So they act as external auditors to these machine learning models as well. Interpretation results could be either local or global or local. So global will help us, like in general, how to understand how the model actually perform and how does it reach its decision at a global kind of context. But if you want to explain like a particular decision of the model, for example, like if someone goes to a bank and asks for a loan and the loan gets denied, then we can basically query the model using these tools. And we can query this model and say why this particular decision for this particular individual and this particular loan was made. And then we'll get results just like what you see here on the slide. And on the left, you see how this is a typical way of how Lime works. And on the right, you see how Shab works. Basically, they tell you like either positively or negatively how a particular feature has affected the results. So the orange color here is for positive influence. The blue one is for negative influence. And you see that this is a mortality kind of predictor. And the mortality probability here was 78% versus 22%, the complement. Much like the same way SHAP will introduce similar metrics and very similar visualizations. And you can do it again to explain either local decisions, or you can look at the model overall. And this is again, this is taken from generic public data set about the quality, predicting the quality of wine. So it has all of these. It tells you again, it goes with the picture where the model, this particular model was taking a vacation probably. So. Okay, so as a summary and discussion, this is our last slide. AI and machine learning is really, in our opinion, the most efficient way to automate and scale solutions to the complex and very messy problems of access governance. Human biases, as we saw from our couple of examples, can falsify results and mislead mitigation efforts. Access governance or access management is a highly dynamic process, and the efforts that you do to maintain your access model should be continuous, proactive, and predictive, so humans don't fare really well on any of these fronts. Network graph data structures are really is a natural choice to represent access and governance data. The latest AI ML algorithms should not be viewed as black boxes anymore. And they not only provide us with cutting edge performance and superior ways to model certain phenomenon to solve particular business problems, but they also provide us with auditing tools and these open source, for example, machine learning interpretability tools, which enable full transparency of how these models work either globally or locally. Thank you so much. This again has been an effort to basically give you like a bird's eye view of how it looks like AI applications within access governance and access management field. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Again, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn and other social media. My email is right there, so please don't feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you very much. I can't hear you.
How about now?
Yeah.
I got myself on mute. It always happens. All right, so I appreciate it. So as I was saying, I had some questions. We're going to start from the last thing that you showed there. And it had to do with, so SailPoint comes already then with some of these AI models out Correct. Of the box, right?
Yes.
But we can modify those models. We can create our own models and then use this third-party tools to audit them to see if they're going to do the same thing, or did I get that incorrect?
Well, definitely. I mean, what I was presenting is the potential that anyone can train their own models, and anyone can audit their own models using these open source tools. Okay. What we do as SailPoint is that we train our models. Then in the UI, as part of the UI of the products that we sell, we provide the user with immediate response. Like they can click on the decision, and basically a pop-up will come out and say, oh, this decision was approved or denied because XYZ.
Okay. All right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. The other thing also is when you showed the outliers and everything in that example about that person has 33%, but you didn't know, right? Because unless you fully analyze it. So it means that we can definitely start using this as a new tool that's part of our SOC, correct? For day-to-day type of thing, and also to, predictive, right? So it's like, hey, you added somebody new and you gave him all these things. Why? You can have that. Okay.
So it's not just the outlier, it's just one of many. So if you look at the slide that says ML and access governance. So some of these use cases, like for example, the role mining and the access modeling, which is basically identify the highly dense clusters That's basic. These are the roles, and basically what we're finding is that, and that's actually was illustrated by one of the visualizations I used on one of the slides. When you actually map the roles current for most of our customers, you'll see a lot of role granularity there.
Yes.
People have like on average like 50 roles, and each role has like 3 or 5 entitlements. So here, what's the point here? The point is that these roles currently that we see from the humanly designed kind of access models, they do not reflect or represent the job function of the identity. So if I'm a data scientist or a software engineer or an accountant, I have 50 roles because neither one of these 50 roles represent exactly what I do day to day at my organization. So basically, a lot of consolidation needs to happen. And one way to identify these consolidation actions is basically using the clustering techniques based on our graph data structure that I just pointed out or explained.
Yeah, and that was my next question. You just answered, because that was with that graph with everything was green and they're all the same. Basically, they'll have the same role, but they're multiple roles, correct? That's what you were showing there.
Yes.
And so then and that's normal to all organizations because you have multiple people in the history of the organization in charge of the identity management program.
Yes.
So everyone creates their own roles and they don't realize, hey, this role already existed because there's no easy way to review that. So this is a fantastic tool.
Yeah. The thing also about consolidating identical and near identical roles is the simplicity. So we're not saying change anything. Right. Keep the 10 software engineering roles that you have, because they maybe vary by team or by location, what have you, sure. But maybe add a label so that during a certification campaign or an audit, you just say these 10 are just the same. So if you want to certify them as such. They're just made up of the same exact entitlements.
Okay.
So if you want to certify the entitlements, then just use one set instead of 10 different sets. Just maybe ask one person instead of asking 10 at the same time.
Got it. So yeah, okay. So that minimizes the whole thing. But it also, I mean, it helps to reduce, when we have complexity, we have basically chaos, right?
Yeah, of course.
And we have the issues, right, that we find ourselves right now is like, somebody has access to equipment or an application that they shouldn't have access to. And we're like, well, it's because they had rights from a project 3 years ago.
Yes.
And it was never removed and we never knew anything about it.
Yes.
So this can also be used as part of the first steps in establishing an identity governance program. I mean, correct? So you can use it at the beginning, you can use it to maintain it, you can use it as part of the audits.
Yeah. So here's the thing. So we get this question a lot, and this is actually a very good question. Well, my company particular products cannot tell you what tools to use to do what. So other than that, once you give, so there is always what's called the cold start problem in, like, for example, recommender systems, right? It's like if you go to Amazon and open an account now, or go to Netflix doesn't necessarily know much about you to recommend anything. That's called the cold start problem. So much like that happens on our end as well. So, but once you have like very basic entitlement assignment, right? Once you start assigning certain access tokens to your employees, then our tools can work, because then we can identify patterns. And once we can identify patterns, we can identify what's normal, what's not normal, and all these kind of use cases come together.
Okay. So, and how usually does it take for that learning to take place in a typical environment?
I mean, if it's a graph query, it's milliseconds.
Oh,
I mean, yeah, because the thing about graphs is that you can store them in what's called a graph database. For example, Neo4j is one of the many examples, right? So once you store a graph in a database, you can query it, and you can query it really, really in phenomenal, like millisecond performance usually. If it's a machine learning model, the training usually takes minutes, maybe, for some can take several minutes or tens of minutes, fine. But the inference time for models is, again, millisecond performance.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah. So So it's a no-brainer use case, to be honest. I think one of the main, there are two hurdles, I think, for AI to be used widely for access governance. That's why it's kind of coming late to the party a little bit.
Yeah.
One is actually the privacy that Eli was brilliant talking about that. And the other thing is the black box issues that most of the customers in that field, they have audit processes. And they have to explain to a human auditor, like why certain decisions have been made. So if you have a black box model, I don't, yeah. But with these recent machine learning interpretability tools, that's no longer a concern.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, Mo, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank
you for the information. Thank you to SailPoint. And I already told Mike, thanks for connecting us. So
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
See you later.